To decide, we're taking you now to the race for the White House. Republican candidates vying for the nomination are on the move across the country, the world, and even right here in South Carolina. That would be former President Donald Trump. He'll be in Columbia tomorrow to speak at the party's Silver Elephant Dinner. And just yesterday, he pleaded not guilty in federal court after he was indicted by a grand jury. And he's accused of trying to overturn the 2020 election to remain in power. But he calls those charges a witch hunt.
When you look at what's happening, this is a persecution of a political opponent. This was never supposed to happen in America.
And moving out to the Midwest, where Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is making his case to voters in Iowa. This all part of his Never Back Down bus tour. And recently, his campaign announced 35 new endorsements from South Carolina leaders, including some in our area. And he spoke about the support in the upstate.
You look at the upstate region, these are voters that see a governor like me who has produced and delivered results on the issues that they care about, that reflects their values, and is somebody that they can be proud of as a leader.
And South Carolina Senator Tim Scott visiting the border to discuss security with local leaders in Arizona. Scott criticized President Biden's border policy, and he said if elected, he'd work to combat drug trafficking.
As President of the United States, I've signed the legislation I created that would freeze the assets of the Mexican cartels. We have the power to do that, and frankly, it's good news. My bill has been passed through the Senate, and hopefully will become law before this year is over.
And former New Jersey Governor Christie taking his campaign global, going to Ukraine. There he met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Christie toured war-torn areas and spoke of his support for Ukraine in the fight against Russia.
I am an advocate for there being more aid to Ukraine, more significant aid to Ukraine, broader aid to Ukraine.
Christie also told reporters that he wanted Americans to see what he has seen in Ukraine to help bolster support. And former Vice President Mike Pence in New Hampshire right now. This is a look at a town hall Pence hosted just an hour ago. New Hampshire is the second state in the primary process and is known for being an indicator of which candidate independent voters prefer. Pence will stay in the state this weekend and will speak tomorrow on national security. Meanwhile, the other candidates staying busy as well. Former Governor Nikki Haley plans to speak with voters in Iowa this weekend, and businessman Vivek Ramaswamy says he would pardon President Trump if elected. The Iowa caucus is set for January 15th.